So first, I think we should have some basic background information on the man. Hegel was born August 27th, 1770 in Stuttgart, then part of the ancient Duchy of Württemberg. His father was a low-level bureaucrat to the Duke of Württemberg, and his mother the daughter of a prominent lawyer and legal scholar who was in the service of the duchy. He attended the theological school at Tübingen, where he was roommates with Friedrich Hölderlin and Friedrich Schelling. Schelling would also be one of his professorial colleagues at Jena. He was also, as many know, an early enthusiast of the French Revolution. Like many young middle-class Europeans, however, the excess of the terror turned him sharply in opposition to the extreme form of revolutionary Jacobinism that swept the country. Nevertheless, he remained an admirer of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, and that is an essential aspect of understanding Hegel's larger philosophical works. So, Hegel's corpus is extensive, and as I mentioned, I will be drawing and synthesizing the general arc of Hegel's systematic philosophy from the Phenomenology of Spirit, the lectures on the philosophy of history, and the elements of the philosophy of right. In most ways, Hegel inherits the post-idealist Fichtean and Schelling thrust of philosophy concerning the end rights with each other that provide for ethical community. Hegel goes a step further in his politicization of the movement of philosophy and the formation of law, order, and political structures as a manifestation of our recognition of each other in historical progress. Understanding Hegel is often difficult due to his verbose style. However, once you're able to deconstruct Hegel's language, most of what he says is somewhat straightforward and easy to grasp. In the second section of the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel, in my opinion, gives his easiest and most straightforward analogy to the whole of his philosophical vision. In this section, he tells the story of a plant bud blossoming to yield fruit. It begins as a seed, becomes roots and stems, eventually emerging with a bud, and the bud blossoms into a flower, and the flower is pollinated and then brings forth fruit. It is only at the end of this process that we can know what the entire process of necessary unfolding entailed. We must also now, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, understand something about the purpose of the world spirit, the Geist. The purpose of the world spirit is to negate, destroy the uncultured naturalistic simplicity, the Ungebilder, and the naturalistic simplicity of individuality, the Einzelsein, which accompanies that primordial state of existence, and in the destruction of naturalistic simplicity and individuality, we move toward a higher, newer reality of integration. The negative terror, which purges the world and individuals into a new state of living, is the ethical community, as Hegel later goes on to define and describe in detail in the later sections of the Phenomenology, and especially in the elements of the philosophy of right. We must understand then that the negative or negationary aspect of the world spirit has a purposive, constructive, and higher purpose to it. It is not merely to destroy and entirely eradicate. It is to destroy in order to progress. we might better understand this phenomenology within Hegel's philosophy as a necessary purgatorial transition out of the old and into the new. Hegel's philosophical system is anti-reductionist and therefore explicitly Schellingian and Goethean in nature. In fact, the phenomenology structure mirrors that of Schelling's system of transcendental idealism. It considers the whole picture, as it were, and understands philosophy as the task of engaging with purposive activity. From guiding tendency into activity to aims and results. The task of philosophy is to penetrate the phenomenon of activity, to understand the guiding tendency's unfolding development to results, which Hegel calls the Sache selbst, or the real issue of philosophy. This means, as Hegel said at the end of the preface of the Philosophy of Right, philosophy only comes to know the reality of the world at the close of its unfolding development. Philosophy only takes flight at the coming of the shades of dusk. One should immediately see then, from the analogies that Hegel uses, which are in fact comprehensible. He doesn't often use very comprehensible analogies, but again, the analogies of the seed becoming a plant bearing fruit and the owl taking flight at dusk are comprehensible. And we should see how this is part of the very tradition of post-Kantian idealism, where Kant would have us cut off the phenomenological and noumenal worlds at, say, the blossoming of the flower, to use Hegel's analogy. Hegel sees the movement of the phenomenological as revealing the noumenal at the end of the process, if keeping with the Kantian language and dynamic. That is, the noumenal, the thing in itself, the Ding an sich, is revealed at the end of the development process through the realization of the transcendental ideal manifested in corporeal material reality. However, Hegel is anti-reductionist because to reduce the phenomenon of development back to its origo, the seed, is to have clearly misunderstood what one was observing. In this way, Hegel is against the empirical utilitarian sciences emerging out of British and French materialism, which look at things through a deconstructive, reductionist lens. For instance, the British and French empiricists look at the whole of society, destroy the whole of society, and want to get back to the original seed. Hegel and the German tradition is the exact opposite. It starts with the seed and tries to understand how this complex phenomenon of integration and wholeness occurred. Likewise, to only focus on the results is to focus on the, quote, lifeless corpse that has left the guiding tendency behind. So in this regard, Hegel doesn't think that only looking at the end point, the total wholeness, is the purpose of philosophy. He also wants to understand how it reached this particular realization and manifestation in the world. Again, the purpose of Hegel's philosophy is to understand the purposive activity of movement and manifestation to the whole. Hegel is fighting against reductionism and utilitarianism by emphasizing a sense of organic holism in philosophy. This is why Hegel asserts the truth is the whole. Only at the end stage do we understand the truth of the whole. The absolute is the result and the realized manifested in the world through the activity of the spirit. Hence, as he says, the rational is real and the real is rational. Hegel may be an idealist, but the functional manifestation of his philosophy is ironically empirical, as is the case, in fact, with most of the German idealists once you start to understand them. They are not concerned with the ideal in the realm of forms, like Plato and the Platonists. Instead, they are concerned with how the ideal manifests itself in corporeal reality. It is a philosophy about the world of experience. It is a philosophy concerned with the incarnate or embodied living in the corporeal world which we exist in. It is a philosophy of the real, of thought and action united instead of separated. The unfolding of truth and its incarnate manifestation in the world is the purposive activity that reason is. Hegel maintains a sense of classical ontological teleology, but one that is in the process of becoming rather than one that is fixed in a fixed state as a given. This is double play on Hegel's part. Many Aristotelians, for example, criticize Hegel's concept of being and non-being, of becoming and non-becoming. This is due to misunderstanding Hegel's pontifical philosophy. He bridges being and non-being, becoming and fixity together as one. For, in a sense, man has a fixed state, but that is what he is unfolding to be or to realize. And in that regard, he's not that dissimilar from Aristotle, who also believed that man has a teleological end that he must actualize or manifest over the course of his life through a becoming or training in virtue. That also means, however, at least with regards to Hegel, that man is in this imperfect state and that he is becoming more perfect over time. And this movement out of imperfection to perfection is what he is truly meant for. No one is born in a perfect ontological state. He must progress to a more perfect state over the course of his life, just like how the seed becomes roots, becomes stems, becomes bud, becomes plant, and bears fruit. Let us return to Hegel's image of the plant bud becoming the flower and producing fruit to understand Hegel's philosophical point.
towards unification with the common of the common task. You said immortality and resurrection as the common regulative idea. And only afterwards you mobilize science and techniques, knowledge and art to gain immortality for the living and resurrection for the dead. So here it is very important to recall that Fedorovian cosmology is materialist. It is not described in the language of physics, precisely because physics here is rendered to be instrumental. For Fedorov, it is unable to describe what being is, but it is strong enough to affect being together with art and sciences for the sake of its transfiguration.
aesthetics and thinking in relation to, say, ecological catastrophe and also ideas of terraforming too?
Thank you for your question. When it comes to ecology, I think here we can trust Fedorov and we can trust Cosmis because they were one of the first thinkers who posed these problems seriously. And as I mentioned, for them, the condition, the circumstances, the world turned out to be in the very end of, in the fin du siècle, yes, in the very end of the 20th century. calls it an illusion, but I would call it, you know, a different kind of experience of, you know, expanding the horizons of your, you know, sensual and cognitive perception.
Normally when we think of Tibetan Buddhism, we tend to think of monasteries, of red-robed monks, teachings on universal compassion, but we know comparatively less about the white-robed yogic lineage, which was tended to be practiced outside of monasteries by non-celibate male and female practitioners, and working in a way very directly with the embodied condition of the body, as opposed to the more renunciatory approach taken in the Buddhist sutras. And so the Tibetan yogas are based upon the Buddhist tantras, which emerged in India from the 6th century onward, and they have a different emphasis. And so what this book tries to do is to give a general introduction, a very visual introduction to these more esoteric, you could say occult practices of Tibetan Buddhism. Occult in the sense literally of the meaning of hidden knowledge or secret knowledge. And these practices were often considered to be secret, and they were often given only in an initiatic context between a teacher and a student. practice them. So this book is a departure from that tradition, and that was actually a request by Thomas the Dalai Lama. It literally said the time of secrecy is over, and that these practices should be fully explained rather than sort of halfway explained and halfway concealed. He said that would just lead to greater confusion. So this book is an attempt to kind of reveal this aspect of the so-called completion stages of the Tibetan Buddhist practices, which are based upon the physical body, working with the body, the breath, consciousness in a very dynamic way, as opposed to often just introspective and contemplative way. So, in that sense, the book is structured around what are so-called the 6 yogas, which are the hallmark of the inner tantric Buddhist tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. And these are, of course, based upon the Tibetan Buddhist meditative practices, which are often involve active imagination through creative visualization. But these 6 yogas work much more with the energy body, the subtle body. And it's about activating, in a certain sense, the innate human capacities that are there, not to be dormant in the sense that something we actively engage with. But the beauty of the 6 yogas, which is essentially subject matter of the book Tibetan Yoga, is that these are practices that can be applied at any time, at any stage of life. And the first of the so-called 6 yogas is referred to often as the illusory body, the magical body, in Tibetan. And this is a recognition that all the practices are done with a recognition, not that the body is illusory, that's a literal translation, but it's really the energy body. We want to see it that way. So the fact that we tend to identify with material aspects of the body is really to overlook the fact that matter is energy. And so all of the 6 yogas work with the body as a not just subtle energy, but a very energetic substrate of physical reality. So this is the foundation for all of the 6 yogas. And the first of the foundation, as it's referred to, is Tumo, which is, for those who are familiar with it, the yoga of inner fire. And this is a direct translation of the original Sanskrit word Chandali, which was the goddess of fear, literally means fierce, the fierce feminine. And this was directly translated from Chandali in Sanskrit to Tumo in Tibetan. But we tend to think of it in English as inner fire or inner heat. And this is a very dynamic way of, if we compare it, let's say, to the modern mindfulness movement, which was essentially derived from contemplative monastic practices that were based upon essentially a passive observation of the breath and its coming and its going in order to enter into meditative states. This is a very working dynamically with the breath in order to enter into very profound altered states of consciousness through the out-breath and expansion of the breath rather than just passive observation. So in the practices of inner fire, which is the foundation, it's a gathering of energy in the cradle, working with the central channel of the body, which is the medium in which these 6 yogas take place. And we see this across different traditions. Of course, it's not something unique to Tibetan Buddhism, but Tibetan Buddhism has been very sophisticated in its development of these practices. The general way in which these practices are done with the Tumo, because it is the foundation, so it's starting at the foundation of the body, as I said, in the pelvic cradle, if you will, and working with what we now think of as this gut-brain axis. And so this is working with a kind of harmonization and synchronization of different centers in the body that we think of as chakras, of course, in the esoteric Eastern traditions. And this leads to the yoga of inner fire, leads to what's called the yoga of clear light, the Yosin. And this is really this innate nature of human embodiment as light, as luminosity. And so these are dynamic practices like the yoga of inner fire for entering into that state of what's often described as bliss, clarity, and emptiness. And so the book goes into quite a lot of detail as to different kinds of methods, the physical practices that can be done in order to enter into that luminous continuum, which is held to be the transpersonal reality.
Century has its origins in one of the papers that Hardy and Ramanujan wrote. The amazing achievements with regard to the theory of modular forms and their applications in number theory, although Ramanujan certainly was not the one to have discovered modular forms, he nonetheless had an insight in them and an understanding of questions related to them that truly shaped a number of studies and achievements in the 20th century, so that this period of time, these 4 years between 1914 and 1918, more or less, were an absolutely amazing achievement. In 1918, he contracted an illness, and there's great debate about what the illness was. It was thought at the time to be tuberculosis. A variety of people speaking 70, 80, 90 years later say that it was some other form of illness, perhaps related to problems with amoebas, perhaps a vitamin deficiency, perhaps a variety of things. To think up things I could do that would be academically appropriate. And one of the things I knew was that the late G.N. Watson had papers from his estate that had been contributed to the Trinity College Library. And Watson, Watson early in his career, in the 1930s, was very interested in the work of Ramanujan and indeed studied the notebooks that Bruce has finally brought into this full 5-volume account. So, and Watson wrote a number of papers on this. So I thought that his papers might be of interest, so that was one of the things I proposed to do. So I walked into the Trinity College Library and asked them to bring out the boxes of Watson's papers, which they did. And in one of the boxes were things related to Ramanujan. There was the actual last letter that Ramanujan had written that I have just discussed, that is set in type at the end of his collected papers. So that letter is there. In addition to that, there were 100 pages, some written on both sides, so about 140 or so pages of Ramanujan type formulas, very similar to the notebooks that Bruce had dealt with, the notebooks that Ramanujan had written before going to England. just chosen one set of formulas which seem to me to illustrate the sort of thing that is disturbing to both outsiders and insiders about Ramanujan. So here are some formulas or some series that are written at the top of one page in Ramanujan's notebook. This is my handwriting. I may have blown things up so you can see them, but I've tried to copy exactly what is on that page. Now, these formulas all look rather similar. They have similar ways of each term looks very much like the previous one, although in each case there's a difference in each line from one to the next. So maybe they do have some relationship to one another. And indeed, it turns out that they do have a relationship to one another.